Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 16. 16. I'm trying to think of what 16 is in Spanish, but I don't know. Do you know what 16 is in Spanish, Eric, by any chance?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, sorry for those of you listening and that want to know what 16 is in Spanish, just Google it. All right. So anyway, this particular episode is brought to you by Dawn and David. Dawn and David went to our website, soberspeak.com. They clicked on the donate tab and they made a contribution. Thank you so much, Dawn and David, for your generous contribution. This episode with Eric is for you. At Sober Speak, you will find podcasts of people sharing their experience, of people sharing their recovery, much like you do at an AA speaker meeting. These men and women share their experience, strength, and hope centered around the Alcoholics Anonymous 12 Steps of Recovery. My name is John M. I'm an alcoholic. I'll be the host of this episode. Consider this Sober Speak meeting, if you will, a meeting between the meetings. So I have asked Eric, who is here with me today, to read a daily reading, a portion. I just asked him to bring in something that would be so I can't even talk today, would be something that he would like to read, and so he's brought it in.
Yes, so this is from page 42 of the big book. It's the first paragraph of the beginning of chapter 4, We Agnostics. And it says, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably an alcoholic. So I thought that was great. That was actually the definition of alcoholism from the big book.
I like that, Eric. So maybe I'll ask you a little bit more about that in a moment, okay? So we welcome all of your comments. You can get in touch with us in a couple of different ways. You can go to soberspeak.com and click on the Contact Us tab, or you can email us directly at feedback@soberspeak.com. We not only welcome your feedback, but highly encourage it.
Please remember, we do not speak for any 12-step community. We represent only ourselves. We are here to share our experience, strength, and hope with those who wish to come along for the ride. Take what you want, leave the rest at the curb.
Super. So before we get into Eric's story here in just a moment, I mentioned this on a few podcasts ago, but I want to put this at the top of this podcast, and that is I want to just publicly thank my wife, Shannon, for assisting with getting this podcast up and running and keeping it maintained. She's the one who sets up the website. She does all of the social media stuff. She does a lot of technical work in the background, and I am just forever thankful to her for doing that. So love you, honey, and thank you for all your work with this. So, all right, so now let's go ahead and turn a corner. We're going to talk to Eric. So, Eric, I have heard you once before. It really caught my attention. Your description, if you will. I don't want to say you rewrote the steps. That's like telling somebody at church you rewrote the Bible or whatever. But you summarized or put in a synopsis form the 12 steps of recovery for you so you could understand it better. Could you go through those once and kind of maybe even before kind of explain the process of what got you to actually doing that?
Yeah, so I thought it was really difficult for me when people in the AA meetings would reference various steps and they'd be like, okay, so I was working on step 7, or I was doing step 9, or I was doing step 11 or step 4. And I was like, I could not rattle off the top of my head, what in the world are they talking about? And this was early on in the initial few months of my sobriety and going to AA meetings. And so just in my head, I went through as short, I don't want to call it a summary, just a couple of key words for kind of each of the steps. Mm-hmm. So for step 1, it's I am broken. Step 2.
Well, so let's take those a step at a time here, because it's really interesting to me the way you summarize it, right? So step 1 is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and oh man, I'm blanking here. We admitted we were powerless over, and that our lives had become unmanageable. And then you kind of took that and you said the step 1 for you, so you could understand it and kind of internalize it a little bit better. And it sounds like it's abbreviated as I am broken.
Yeah.
Do you remember what sort of process?
Yeah, all this really. So I guess, appropriately, my my own sponsor's name is Bill, and Bill was super helpful, of course, in reading through the big book and how it works together. But pretty early on in the process, we started reading through the 12 and 12 as well, because some of the steps, as most people listening know, some of the steps in the big book are very short. Yeah. And so the 12 and 12 goes through those steps that are very short in more detail. And so when we would go to a step that was very short in the big book, Bill would say, okay, well, let's go to the 12 and 12 and read it in there. And there would be a good 15, 20, 30 pages on it. And I found that to be super helpful. Whether it was step 6 and 7, I think are really short in the big book. And in and in the 12 and 12, the ones about asking God to remove our shortcomings and humility. That just hit home, and it hit home a lot more in reading the 12 and 12. And so anyway, I believe that in talking about step 1 in the 12 and 12, it talks about brokenness. And so that's where that came from.
Gotcha. Okay. Very cool. So, so step 2, let's go. What was your...
Okay, so step 2 is have an open mind.
Okay, so let's once again, and I'm not came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us sanity. So you kind of abbreviated that. Just say have an open mind, right? Which is basically what it talks about in both the book and the 12 and 12. It says, just barely open up the door, or crack the door. Or I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, and that's literally that's not my words. That is almost literally what it says in the last paragraph of step 2 in the 12 and 12.
Yeah.
And so when you read the 12 and 12, it's great because the last paragraph of each step really basically tries to encapsulate what that step is.
Yeah.
And so that's what it says in that last paragraph for step 2 is to just have an open mind.
So when you kind of internalize have an open mind, how did that manifest itself in your life? In other words, what do you think you did not have an open mind about? And
oh yeah, no, that's great because a central part of being an alcoholic and a central part of AA meetings and AA is being delusional and being in denial, right? So it's being in denial of being an alcoholic, and it's being in denial of being broken. And step 2 is about being in denial. You could be seen as being in denial about being open-minded. So it's okay, well, what's the opposite? Everyone's like, of course I'm open-minded. Everybody thinks they're open-minded.
We all think we're
but okay, so fine. What's the opposite of open-minded? In some senses, it's being quick to judge things. And so it's okay, as the blinders started to come off about my own denial and delusion, I'm I am really quick to judge things. I'm quick to judge a lot of things. And it's amazing how, and obviously I was quick to judge my lack of being an alcoholic. And so I obviously had to take a step back and be no, I am broken, and then, I really had to take a step back about being open-minded. And it was because if you're not open-minded, then obviously step 2 is there for a reason, because it's real hard to do steps 3 through 12 if you're not open-minded about it. And it's one of the Dawn from our group says, probably something that a lot of people say, which is you come for the drinking and you stay for the thinking. And so the application of being open-minded, not only to the 12 steps, but just around so many other aspects of my life. I found that I was quick to judge a lot of things. I'm married, I have 3 kids, and it might be something as, simple as, hey, Dad, let's go out in the backyard and jump on the trampoline. or, maybe, hey, can I eat this, before dinner? And so I would be like, I would be very quick to judge and be like, well, no, you can never eat anything before dinner because it will ruin your appetite, right? And, sometimes it's like, well, dinner's going to be kind of late tonight and you want to eat an apple. I really have no problem with you eating an apple before dinner. Like, it's okay. And
we're all going to survive.
Right. And so obviously that's a sort of, but I was just doing that so much. And so now if I kind of pause and I say to myself, okay, well, what if I was just open-minded about this? I found that in a lot of ways, I've kind of like been more patient. I've taken in more information before making a decision. I've not been so quick to judge things. And so, anyway, long-winded answer as to why step 2 is have an open mind.
No, I like that. So, and I kind of breezed past step 1 in that I am broken there. Yeah. So I want to dive into that a little bit because, as you said, there's a lot of denial, right? People don't really think that they're broken, and then they come into the program, they start going through inventory, start looking at the steps, and they realize I'm broken. So in what ways did you realize after you got into the program that you were broken, that you had not thought of before?
Yeah, and that's where the big book was really helpful with that, in that it talked about how when I went to my first AA meeting on a Thursday evening at 5:30 or 5 p.m. And the nice woman who was chairing the meeting gave me a copy of the big book. And I've come to find out that is actually not a regular practice, that a lot of times people are not given the big book right away in their first meeting. And I got there early. I was like the first person there besides her, so we had like 15, 20 minutes to kill. And she's like, I guess it was fairly obvious that I was new. So she's like, you're new here. And I'm like, yeah. And so she's like, okay, well, there's this book. And she gives me the book. And a lot of people say that, they're not big into reading, and it's completely understandable that the big book is kind of written in, 1930s era, English, and it's hard to read. I totally get that. I personally love to read, and that's probably the best way for me to absorb things. And so, I think that for a lot of people, the most tenuous days of their sobriety are in the first few days of going to their first AA meeting. It's like, you're making a drastic change where, people like myself have gone from like drinking daily for a very long time to all of a sudden, or almost daily, to okay, so now we're going to like stop for a while, a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week. And for me to immediately be able to turn to a book that I can read, and the punchline is like, it was a real page turner. And every single page that I read, I was nodding my head. I was like, yep, that's me. Yep, I agree with that. Yep, I can see that. And especially the part around resentment, which is fairly early in the big book, where it says, something to the effect of, we alcoholics find that we have a lot of resentment. And I said to myself, you know what? I never really thought of it that way. I always had different euphemisms for the word resentment. I would call it frustration, right? Or maybe sometimes anger, but it was typically frustration. And I'm like, at the end of the day, that frustration is really resentment, right? And I'm like, I don't even know what resentment means. I had to look it up. And it means justifiable anger. And I was like, that's totally true. I was angry, but I felt like I was justified in my anger. And then I was like, and then of course, the big book quickly points out like that resentment is like, it's like, rattlesnakes and tarantulas, that it's like a really like dangerous thing, and that you need to let go of that. And that, having resentment is gonna come back to bite you, no pun intended. And so I was real, I'm like, what? I'm resentful. And that was kind of the beginning of the, the tip of the iceberg, and just realizing that, I'm broken. And I've realized, I'm broken about a lot of other things too. And one of the really unique things about AA meetings that I particularly enjoy is that you're in a room with a bunch of other people that also see and acknowledge their own brokenness. And it's like, how many places or how many times in your life are you around a bunch of other people that also realize they're broken? And it's like almost never. Like, you're almost never in a situation like that. Okay, so fine. So
At the dinner parties, it's not like we're sitting around.
or at work, or at home, or at church. I mean, you name it. Civic group or club, sports team. I mean, you name it. You're never going to be in a situation where you're around a bunch of people who realize that they're broken.
It's not like I get on a call at work and say something like, "How you doing, John, today?" Well, you know what? I'm feeling a little resentful, dishonest, selfish, and afraid today.
Yeah.
How are you doing out there?
Yeah, I'm just and it is, and then, but what the gift of acknowledging brokenness, in some ways, is the blinders have come off. In other words, that the delusion and denial goes away. And it doesn't go away completely, and it comes back like on a daily basis. But if I can acknowledge on a daily basis that I'm broken, then I can also on a daily basis work to not live in denial, right? Because because of our, and the big book talks a lot about pride too. So because of our pride, we try to trick ourselves and lie to ourselves into thinking that we're not broken, and so therefore we go down this path of delusion and denial, and we apply that to all other aspects of our life in terms of our relationship with our family, or our coworkers, or our finances, or our faith. And so I'm like, okay, so I'm broken. And everybody else in this room that also knows that they're broken. And also, I'm learning how to not be in denial. And I'm in a room surrounded by a whole bunch of other people who are not in denial. And that's awesome. Because if you, think about all the other situations where you're around people, you find that, wow, a lot of people are in denial about a whole bunch of stuff. And it's amazing. The human mind's capacity to be in denial is just incredibly powerful. And it took, being an alcoholic and being broken for me to realize that.
What about that? Do you remember anything else about that first meeting? I know you talked about it a little bit, but is there anything else that comes out of that?
Well, it's just that the people in the meeting. So that Thursday evening meeting, it was relatively small, maybe 15. Maybe 20 people, and everybody just immediately right out of the gate started talking about their own brokenness. And, like many Amy's, they were just recounting very specific stories. And, it was one story about a woman who had been sober for 16 years and then had gone out and started drinking again for 8, and now was on her second round of sobriety and had been sober for 4 or 5 years. And she talked a lot about that sort of interim period of being out drinking again, and with a room full of strangers, and just incredibly honest about her own brokenness, and kind of coming full circle. And then, another person talking about being so drunk in their Uber car that they let their Uber driver into their apartment, and their Uber driver stole money and jewelry from them. And, again, room full of strangers, and it's just these types of things. And both for that one person and then for the second person, they were like, I got a problem with alcohol. And it was and they were very forthcoming about that. And I just think about how, everybody, everybody, a lot of people tend to put on facades, or they tend to accentuate the positive and not talk about the negative. It's the whole Facebook thing where you only post the really nice pictures of your, trips and blah, blah, blah on Facebook, but you never show the bad stuff. Right. And it was it's the exact opposite of Facebook. Right. And so, and it was,
I've never thought about it that way.
But that's what I needed to see those blind spots, and just to be oh man, I got a lot of blind spots, but so does everybody else. I mean, everybody's broken. Maybe the only difference between alcoholics and a lot of other people is we just realize that we're broken, and a lot of other people don't realize how broken they are, because we're all broken.
Right.
But once you acknowledge that, it's the fourth dimension doesn't come right away, but you can start to see the beginnings of the fourth dimension.
Yeah. So, I know you were talking a little bit there about, having a hard time for most of us admitting that we're broken, because of our situation and such. And I want to talk about this a little bit, because I think it's important in your particular scenario. Can you talk about the kind of a career you had and what led up to that and why it may be, because I know anyway, I know a little bit about your background. Why don't you tell the folks about your background and why it may have been hard to admit that you were broken, so to speak?
Yeah, so I'm a physician, and my drinking career didn't really start until the end of college for me, because I just had my nose buried in a book, and I was in the library constantly.
Thus the reading.
Yeah, I just that's just I knew I had to I knew I wanted to go to medical school, so I had to get good grades in order to do that. And even then, even in my senior year, it was weekends, but nothing. I didn't. Some people talk about alcoholism, and it's like, well, as soon as they started drinking, then they started having the mental obsession. And at least in retrospect, I really didn't. Like, I didn't, when I wasn't, drinking with my, friends on the weekend, I didn't really think about alcohol. And then I worked for 2 years before going into medical school. And then in medical school, again,
what kind of job did you have when you?
I was working as a hospital finance consultant. So this was back in the 90s, with the internet boom and everything, and it was just a great opportunity to go out and get some work experience and to get a job. And the average age of people starting medical school is actually about 24 anyway. So
really?
A fair number of people actually do have some degree of time in between undergrad and going to medical school. So it was really it was a fantastic learning experience. Just learned about the how the working world works. Kind of just getting up in the morning, going to work, and it's like, coming home late at night and, having an apartment and having roommates and paying bills and just, kind of being an adult, which, sort of, but then when again, it was at that point, it was not an obsession.
Were you married? I knew you.
No, I was single at the time. And I guess that, for me, like, what I realized, obviously after, years and years of denial, that I was an alcoholic, because when I wasn't thinking, I was thinking about drinking. When I wasn't drinking, I was thinking about drinking. And that's why I read that passage today, because, on page 42 of the big book, where it says, hey, if you tried to stop and you really found that you couldn't, or if you drank and you ended up drinking a lot more than you originally intended, then you're probably an alcoholic. Right. And it didn't start out that way for me, but it evolved into that. For me, and it really evolved into that in my residency. So after you're done with medical school, that's when you choose your specialty. And I was in the hospital, staying working 30 to 36 hour shifts every fourth night for 3 years. And
what was your specialty?
General internal medicine.
Gotcha.
And so it's a lot of, strokes and heart attacks and bleeding ulcers and cancer and kidney failure. And it was really a lot of, in the medical profession and for physicians, being imperfect is unacceptable. And we have this tendency to want to control everything, because we feel like we can, because here someone is coming to you and they're very ill, potentially on the verge of death, and they are asking you to stop that from happening. And they're asking you to stop that from happening. Their family members are asking you to stop that from happening. All the nurses and all the other staff around you are asking you that. So you have this incredible social pressure to stop them from dying, because that's the whole point. That's why you're there. And guess what? Sometimes you can. And, and I, literally people at death's door, and, there's this one woman who was a heroin addict. She shot up heroin. She had what's called endocarditis, which is a real bad infection of her heart, and it was spreading the infection all over her body, to the point where she had these infections in both of her lungs that causes lung failure. She popped holes in both of her lungs, so both of her lungs collapsed. She infected her kidneys, so her kidneys failed. She had sepsis, which means that her infection was so bad that her blood pressure dropped incredibly low, and she survived. It was unbelievable. She was in the ICU for 6 weeks, and she walked out of the hospital. Wow. And I saw her in the clinic, And I'm like, Miss H, like, you realize that you're a miracle. And she's like, I know. I mean, so it's unbelievable. I mean, she was a goner. I mean, she was, she's on the ventilator. I mean, she was on dialysis. I mean, you name it. And she came back. And so what happens is that you get those, it's almost like the lottery, or it's like a slot machine where you try to exert your will and your power, and guess what? Sometimes it works, but I would say that a lot of the times it doesn't. Right. And the person's cancer progresses and it metastasizes, or they pass away, or they bleed to death, or they lose a limb from, they lose their foot or their leg from their diabetes.
So I've always been curious, so how does that and maybe that's part of what you're talking about here. How does that affect you emotionally, spiritually, and is that why you turn to drinking?
Yeah, it makes you incredibly. It made me incredibly frustrated, which again was my euphemism for
frustrated with what?
With anything and everything. Frustrated with anything that was getting in the way of me accomplishing my goal of saving that person.
Gotcha.
It could be the patient themselves, because they weren't compliant with their medication, or they wouldn't do what they were supposed to do. Or when they went down to the smoking lounge at the hospital, they shot up drugs and then came back to their room high as a kite.
Right.
And so I would be incredibly, angry at them. I'm like, I'm trying to help you, and here you are, engaged in self-destructive behavior.
Right.
Or I would be angry at any medical staff that messed up. And, people make mistakes.
Yeah.
So whether it was a fellow physician or a medical student or a nurse or a technician or different, part of the hospital, like if they messed up, I mean, I was livid.
Gotcha.
And I would be angry at God, right? I mean, it's like the classic case of like, there's the morbid joke in the medical profession that really nice people get cancer. Just the nicest people on the planet.
Right.
And they get struck down. And I had one guy who was an ex-FBI agent, and he was like 44, and he had acute onset leukemia, and his blood counts were through the roof, and he had to be transferred from another hospital over to ours, and his family was in the car driving to meet him. He had been amboed over, and he just broke down bawling because he had two daughters that were like 7 and 9, and he's like, I can't have leukemia. Like, this is like not okay. It's like this guy totally got gypped or struck down. And I was pissed off about it. And then on top of that, I'd be resentful at the hospital and at the residency program for having to stay up 30 to 36 hours every fourth night, because at the end of the day, that's like painful. I mean, it's like, try to put yourself in a high stress situation where you have to do like complex math problems. Right. And not sleep for, a day and a half. And that's like, it's like physically painful. Like I would have like it was funny, myself and my fellow residents, we would always talk about this, this gnawing, incredibly bad heartburn and stomach pain that we would get while we were on call. And it was a combination of drinking massive amounts of coffee to stay awake, and just the stress of having people, potentially at death's door, and like, you need to do something about it. And I was mad at medical school for not preparing me for this. And that's what every doctor says. It's like, look, medical school does not prepare you for residency. You get in there and it's, trial by fire, and you're just thrown in, and you better figure it out. And that's exactly what happens. All the attending physicians go home at 5 or 6 p.m. and you're there on your own until 6 a.m. the next day, and you got to figure it out. And so I would come back from the hospital on my days off, and I would drink. And for me, it was really a sense of euphoria that it would give me. And it was like, it was the exact opposite feeling as what I had when I was at the hospital.
And had that euphoria happened in the past with you when you drank in college?
It had, but it had never been, but I had other sources of euphoria. So, like, I had, like, hobbies and friends, right? And I was in a city where I didn't know anybody, and all my friends that were fellow residents, when I was off, they were working, and when I was working, they were off. So I didn't have the camaraderie to be able to, like, hang out with people. So I was incredibly isolated. And at the end of the day, alcohol was just really easy. Yeah. It was right there. And I was in a neighborhood where I could walk, so I didn't have to drive anywhere. And, so it's like any other type of like outlet whether it be, social interaction or playing sports or, what have you. And, and of course, that's the alcohol in me talking, because I could have done all those things, but I didn't. I chose to drink instead because it was easy. It was easy, and it produced immediate euphoria.
Right. And I have to, and I have so many questions I want to ask, but this is one of them, right? And then we'll get on kind of more back to your story. But being on the inside looking out, we always hear about what does the medical profession know and not know about alcoholism, and are they, when you go to the doctor, I mean, sometimes they just want to give you, what's that, a Xanax or whatever the case may be. So what did they teach you about alcoholism when you're going through your residency and stuff?
Well, it is so the official medical term for alcoholism. So alcoholism is the layman's term. It's not the medical term. So the actual medical term is referred to as medical use disorder, and it's a psychiatric diagnosis.
Medical use disorder.
Alcohol use disorder.
Alcohol use. Okay, gotcha.
Alcohol use disorder, and all the mental illnesses in psychiatry are in something called the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the DSM. It's the 5th version that has come out. So in the DSM-5, it's referred to as alcohol use disorder, and it has criteria, and there's criteria for depression, there's criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, there's criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, there's criteria for schizophrenia, and there's criteria for alcohol use disorder. And at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons why I read that passage from page 42, is that to a certain extent you can fudge the whether or not somebody has like alcohol use disorder in terms of like how you interpret the criteria and how you interpret that towards yourself or to another patient. And I think at the end of the day, it's like, well, if you tried to stop and you couldn't, or if you drank more than you originally intended, the 1930s definition is pretty good. Right. And so, at the end of the day, there's thought to be, hey, there's, some degree of, genetic component. There's even some degree of thought that there actually are a subtype of people who drink that actually have what's referred to as an opioid-like reaction to alcohol. In other words, it stimulates their brain in a similar way that heroin or opioids stimulate people's brains, and those people become especially addicted to alcohol. And that, whether you want to say that's the scientific equivalent of the quote unquote allergy, I don't know. That's kind of beyond the realm of our discussion today. But at the end of the day, alcohol it's a very small molecule, right? So it's just ethyl alcohol. So it's 2 carbons, some hydrogen, and then a hydroxyl group, an OH. That's ethyl alcohol. And because it's such a small molecule, it goes into your brain, and that's why it makes you feel the way that you feel. But obviously it does other things, like it goes into your liver and can cause cirrhosis of the liver. It decreases the amount of mucus that your stomach produces, so it makes your stomach more susceptible to things like bleeding and ulcers. It gets into your nerves, so people can get alcoholic neuropathy. It goes into your heart, and so you can actually have alcoholic cardiomyopathy, where your heart blows up like a balloon and doesn't function properly. It actually causes anemia because it's toxic to your bone marrow. It causes your blood vessels to dilate, which is why many people with alcoholism have a chronic tan. You're like, why is something? It doesn't happen to everybody, but like some people who are alcoholics or who drink a lot, it's not just like they're flushed when they're drunk, they're always flushed. And it's because the alcohol has permanently dilated the capillaries, specifically of their face, so that it makes them look more reddish tinged. So the point is that little alcohol molecule causes damage all over your body. We just happen to feel it in our brains. And that's a very sort of, intellectual or, cerebral, way to it. But at the end of the day, it also stimulates the release of dopamine, right? So in your brain, the release of dopamine is what makes you feel good. That's the euphoric or the buzz effect of drinking alcohol. And so what else releases dopamine in your brain? Well, sugar releases dopamine in your brain. Cocaine releases dopamine in your brain. Heroin releases dopamine in your brain. Some antidepressants release dopamine in your brain, but other things like music releases dopamine in your brain. Conversations and laughter with your friends releases dopamine in your brain. So it's one of the reasons why, going to alcoholic meetings and the fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous is so important, because, okay, if you had this thing that was creating all this dopamine in your brain and that goes away, well, you got to replace it with something. And so that's where the fellowship's incredibly helpful. And that's why, too, in the 12 and 12 and in Living Sober, and from many people that I've heard in Alcoholics Anonymous, that's why eating candy is helpful. It says it in multiple places, right? That alcoholics should probably have chocolate around or candy around.
Yeah, didn't you?
I love candy corn. It's because I sobered up around Halloween, and there just happened to be a lot of candy corn around, and so it's like when was it swans or geese or firstborn, whatever they see first, that's what they identify as their mother. So that just happened to be the first candy that I saw in my sobriety, and so I just identified with candy corn, and so it is, and it's because of that dopamine addictive, and sugar is highly addictive, coffee is highly addictive, all those things are highly addictive because of the dopamine that it stimulates in your brain, which is exactly what alcohol does as well. So that's more of an answer than you wanted to know, but that was all not like rationally and objectively viewed as me as an alcoholic. I was in complete denial about it. And, I don't know what the statistic is, but the percentage of physicians that are alcoholics is higher than the general population. And most hospitals have a program for what they call disabled physicians. So for physicians that are addicted to either drugs and or alcohol, and they need to get help. And it has to be done in a way that does not ruin their career, because many physicians will never get help because if they think that if they get help, it's going to ruin their career. Meaning they can't practice medicine anymore, ever.
Right.
Like they have no source of income. They have no way to support their family. They have put, years and years of training down the tubes. And so they're highly resistant to getting any help. And so they have these anonymous programs at hospitals to try to help the physicians there, and in general, the sense of the people that run those when they come and they speak to the medical staff is that those programs are dramatically underused. So even though they make it anonymous and they try to make it as easy as possible for physicians to get help, physicians are very prideful, right? I mean, that whole idea of being able to cheat death,
like a little god.
It causes tremendous amounts of pride that, which then leads to denial, which leads to not believing in your own personal brokenness at all, and so as a result, it really took, like with many alcoholics, it took a hefty dose of eating humble pie before any of this was possible, which is why the first step for me is I'm broken, because unless you acknowledge that, then nothing else is going to happen. And unless you acknowledge that specifically about alcohol, I'm broken as it relates to alcohol. And then the other thing that I found that was delusional on my part, and that was really key about that first meeting in Alcoholics Anonymous, is that this not drinking anymore needs to be for the rest of your life, and it needs to be absolute. So this is not a program to cut back on your drinking. This is a program to stop drinking completely. And I had never looked at it that way before. I always looked at, I really wish I could just drink less. And then AA was like, no, you have to not drink at all. The only way this is going to work is if you don't drink at all. And that had never occurred to me before. Again, because I was in denial and I was delusional. But I found that was really, and it took me probably like 9 months. And after I got my 9-month chip, I'm like, I'm never going to drink for the rest of my life. And like, I'm totally okay with that. I'm totally okay with that.
Right.
And that is actually, that's been very freeing.
Yeah. So let's go. So I know that there was something happened there when you were going through medical school to where I believe you started at some point did you get out of, or you finished medical school and then started a business or something like that? Is that correct?
That was later on, but that was then when I started drinking heavily in residency. I also started a business, and I got married, and then my wife and I moved. And
what area of the country did you come from? Where were you?
So we were in the Northeast originally, and then we moved to Texas, and the lack of sleep actually got worse, not better. So having small kids that were not good sleepers, and our second child actually had colic, and so he literally screamed for the first 2 years of his life, and so I was just not there was no there were I was so I was working at the hospital, I was starting a business, and then I was getting no sleep at home at night. And so if there was any opportunity other than like those three things, so it was either work, or up at night with the kids, if it wasn't one of those three things, then I would try to drink as much as I could.
That's not a life, is it? So what brought you into, so how did you get into AA? How did you find it?
So I turned 40 in 2016, and for my 40th birthday, my wife threw a very big party at our house. It was great. Neighbors, friends, coworkers came, just great. And of course, everybody brought some type of, like bottle of alcohol as like a present for my 40th birthday, right? If that shouldn't have been a sign, I should have picked up on that. And so that was on a Saturday, and I was just like, well, this is great because I have all this, amazing stuff that I can drink on Sunday. And I spent the entire day on Sunday drunk, and my wife and I got into a big fight. And for the previous 2 years, I had, in my mind, been like, you know what, I'm drinking too much. And for the prior 2 years, I had tried to cut back on my own. And I'm a faithful, religious person. I'm a Christian. I believe in God and I believe in Jesus. And I would pray to God and Jesus to help me not drink. And most of the time I would end up drinking for 2 years. So my approach was not working. And, so if you think about it, that's like over, 2 years, that's like over 700 failed attempts in those prior 2 years. And that's a lot of failed attempts. And going back to the definition of alcoholism, right? And then my wife and I got fired, and I'm like, you're right. And we both agreed to not drink for like, we were going to take like a 3-month break completely. And I did fine for a month, but then I went on a business trip. And while I was on the business trip, I'm like, you know what? I want to have a drink. And so I did. And I drank on the way on the plane there, and I drank while I was there. And I drank on the plane on the way home. And when I got back home, I got caught by my wife. Mm-hmm. And I lied about it. I said, no, those charges on my credit card, those were snacks on the plane. And obviously, again, delusional, even thinking that I, could get away with that and could be dishonest about it. But, that just goes hand in hand with being an alcoholic. And as you can imagine, she and I got into a huge fight, and that was on a Tuesday night. And on Wednesday, was when I told her, and then my parents were visiting, and so I told my parents, I said, I've got a problem and I'm going to go get help. And then that next day was Thursday, and I went to my first AA meeting.
5:30.
And I, when we went around, and in a group of 15 people, in an AA meeting, everyone's going to get a chance to share. And so the woman who was chairing the meeting, she called on me last, and I just said, I'm Eric, and I'm an alcoholic. And that's all I had to say. And those words did not come out easily out of my mouth, as easily as they did now. And it was very hard for me to say it. But I said it, and I meant it. And that was when the beginning of the lying to myself and the denial started to end. And, when I read through the big book and I read about the family healing, I mean, our family is taking a long time to heal, and did take a long time to heal. And it was it really, a lot of what happens in the family healing was happening in our family. And it really helped me because, of course, when being the control freak that, the alcoholics are, I wanted to make things better right away. And it just takes time.
It does. So just out of curiosity, and I see this go different ways with different couples all the time. But can you, I guess at a high level, describe what it's been like with the family getting sober?
Yeah, it has been an incredibly rocky road. And I think it says this in the big book, but I could be wrong. But when I got sober, things got worse, not better. And they got worse for like a year.
And why do you think it got worse? Can you describe that?
I think that it was my wife, justifiably so, felt betrayed and was very upset about that. And with my 3 kids, I say that at the end of the day, I wasn't there mentally. I was there physically. And I was there to rock them to sleep and walk back and forth with them. But because I was an alcoholic, I was thinking about drinking. I wasn't thinking about them.
Right.
And it took, when you're not drinking, it's amazing because when you're drinking, you don't think to yourself how much like a zombie you are. But it's only in your sobriety you're like, holy moly, I was really a zombie.
Right.
I was really half asleep in my entire existence. And so, anybody who's listening to this, you have kids, you've really got to watch your kids, and you got to study them, and you got to watch your spouse, and you've got to study them. And by doing so, it allows you to be a much better husband, and it allows you to be a much better father when you really, study your spouse and you study your kids, and you see, what do they need and what do they not need, and what do they react positively to and what do they react negatively to, because every parent knows that their kids are all very different. And so you have to kind of approach your kids and our kids really would feel. My wife and I had a lot of arguments in that first year of sobriety, and our kids, especially our oldest child, who was 8 at the time, would really see it and could sense it and could feel it. And as my wife and I went to a local church for a marriage ministry that we were in for 4 or 5 months, and that was very helpful. And it helped me learn, and I still don't get this right because again, you always want to fix things, and you want to control things, and it's really, you just got to take it one day at a time. You got to take it one day at a time. I had to take it one day at a time with my sobriety. I have to take it one day at a time with my wife. I have to take it one day at a time with my kids. And yes, there's a lot of things that can happen that need to be planned for, but to a certain extent, you also have to just be prepared for what is going to come by just beginning the day by not drinking and staying sober. And and that sort of patience with the process. And of course, my sponsor Bill was super helpful with it. It took us an entire year to read the beginning of the big book. So the first.
When you say the beginning, 164.
Yeah, the 164. It took 12 months. Right. And that was great. I mean, the fact that it took a year to get through 164 pages was actually incredibly helpful. And I didn't, and maybe some people have taken even longer than that, but I feel like it was very slow and methodical, and it just took that for me to start, and I'm like, and I'm so thankful that I'm able to apply that approach to so many areas of my life going forward. So it was, and I would say too that I'm a much more patient person. Like, obviously, people who drink are temperamental. I was totally temperamental, and I was closed-minded, and I was quick to judge things, and I would try to control things, and I had a lot of pride and ego, and I had a lot of resentment, and by not having resentment, not having pride, not having ego, and I've realized every day I need to work on not having those. It's not like they're, it's not like I've been cured of them. Like, it's just it's a daily thing that you have to stay after. But if you can stay after that, guess what happens? Your relationship with your spouse improves, and your relationship with your kids improves. In fact, just yesterday, I had yelled at my daughter for not following directions because, she had kind of maliciously thrown a football on my son's back, and she was trying to hurt him, and so I scolded her, and I, wanted her to go inside, and she wasn't following directions, and I yelled at her, and then because of the AA program, later on that night, I told her I was sorry, and I asked her for her forgiveness, and the old Eric would not have done that.
Right.
And also, too, I was thinking, I'm like, okay, the reason I got so upset about that was because I felt like she was disrespecting me. And that got under my skin so much because of my pride.
Yeah.
And it's like, she's 9. Right. Why do I have such an ego that I would get so upset about that? And that was just really a fault and a shortcoming on my part to be that way.
Right.
If she, guess what? She's going to be disrespectful in the future. That's just going to happen. Every parent knows that, right? But when that happens, it doesn't have to turn into World War III. It doesn't have to. And I really credit the, AA with having, at least the beginnings of that type of perspective, because my alcoholic mind would not have dealt with it in that way in the past.
So I got you way off track at the beginning of this thing. You were going through your summary of the steps.
Yeah, the shorthand version of the steps, and I'll just go through them all real quick, just so that I can get them out, because I need a little bit of momentum just to make sure I can get them off my tongue. So 1 is I am broken. 2, have an open mind. 3, trust in God. 4, list your sins. 5, confess your sins. 6, have God remove your sins. 7, through humility. 8, list those you've hurt. 9, fix it when possible. 10, do it again and again and again. 11, not my will, but God's will be done. And 12, pass it on.
My favorite is 10, do it again and again and again.
Yeah.
So we call them the maintenance steps, right? Yeah. Well, Eric, time has flown by.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed having you. I'm going to close it up with some comments here, read a little bit out of the big book, and just keep in mind, folks, that we welcome your thoughts and your feedback. Please, once again, contact us at feedback@soberspeak.com or go directly to the website, soberspeak.com. We encourage your input in whatever way you want to give it. We'd like listener input. In other words, you can share your experience, strength, and hope, and provide your comments and suggestions. Thank you for your support in whatever form it comes, whether it's just by sharing the podcast or listening as you were able to. And I'm going to go ahead and read from page 164 here. This is the last couple of paragraphs in the big book. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then. Keep coming back. It works if you work it. Thanks for being here.